All right, all right. Let's get rolling. Whoa. Go ahead and bend that a little farther away. Okay. So, all right, I'll try not to touch that. Fiddling with the mic is great. Okay. Is that okay? Not deafening, but you can hear me? All right. Okay. So last time, what we were talking about was some of the basic physics that we need to remember to know as we think about the movement of blood flow. And what we're going to be thinking about today are features of actual blood vessels that relate to those principles. All right. So I put up a warm up question. Hopefully you've all taken a look at that, but if you haven't, take a second now and I'm going to ask you for your votes. So we're going to be talking about arteries and arterioles today. So I've given you an example of two arterioles. So they have a pressure for both of them of 90, that should be millimeters of mercury at one end and 40 at the other end. They differ in their radii. Arteriole A has an internal radius of 0.025. Arteriole B has a radius of 0.005. So what you're going to tell me is which of these has greater flow going through that arteriole. Now let's take some votes. All right, let's take a look. Okay, good. So we're mostly together on this. So reminders for everybody, right? What we're thinking about for this problem are actually two relationships. So overall, we're thinking about flow, right? Because we're asking which has greater flow, which has less flow. So we know we have to think about pressure differences, and we have to think about resistance. Okay. We're thinking about pressure differences and we're thinking about resistance. In this example, we have the same pressure difference across A and B, so that's not a concern when we're thinking about flow. So this comes down to the resistance. Now, for our resistance, we have to think a little bit further. So when we're thinking about resistance, right, we're thinking about relationships to length, viscosity. Length and viscosity increase, those are directly proportional to resistance. So that would increase resistance, right? So I'm not going to write the exact equation. Say length on top. We have viscosity on top. Okay. But we know that radius, so the width of blood vessels, is inversely proportional to resistance. So when we have a smaller radius, that means we have more resistance. Okay. And so in this case, arteriole A, with its radius of 0.025, had a larger radius than arteriole B with its 0.005 radius. And so it has less resistance. With less resistance, we've got greater flow. Questions about this? Amazing. Okay. And I took a look at my quiz questions. So I did ask you a question that's almost identical twice on that quiz. A couple of you took it already, so I'm not changing it. Hopefully you get it right the first time or the second time, all related to this relationship. Okay, so now we're thinking about the structure and function of our different types of blood vessels and how they relate to blood flow. So what we're asking ourselves here, what kind of differences, what kind of anatomical differences are going to pair up with these different physical properties of physics and physiological differences, so function of the different blood vessels? Okay. So we're going to be thinking about 5 different types of blood vessels. So we're thinking about arteries first. So arteries with that big A away from the heart. So big arteries carrying blood away from the heart. We have branching of larger arteries to smaller arteries. We continue to branch into microcirculation. So this you'd have to look with like a microscope to find these. So our first piece of the microcirculation are our arterioles. They lead to capillary beds, which are the site of exchange, meaning this is where we're going to have like fluid, ions, hormones, and stuff going across the blood vessel walls. Okay. And then we're going to start coming back to the heart. So out of those capillary beds, we're going to go into venules, so little tiny veins essentially, into our bigger named veins that we could see with the naked eye, returning to the heart. So we can see that we're going to have some different features here in this table from your book of those different blood vessels. So one thing we can see immediately from the picture, right, we're going to have differences in the radius and the diameter of those blood vessels. We're going to have some differences in the thickness of the wall and the different layers of that wall of each of these parts of the vasculature. So we're going to start with our arteries carrying blood away from the heart. So we can immediately see here in this image that those arteries, they're going to be big, right? So sorry, I will get the hang of that eventually. These arteries are going to have large radius, large diameter, so therefore lower resistance, greater flow. Okay? They're going to be highly elastic. They've got some muscles in them. These are some of the factors that are going to influence how they behave. Okay, so when we're looking at the walls of blood vessels in general, we can think of some layers. So let's take a look at what we got here. So whenever we're looking at a blood vessel, we're going to have an inner layer that's touching the blood. Okay? So we're going to have a layer preventing you from losing blood out to the rest of your body. So this is your endothelial layer. So this inner layer inside. Okay. So everybody's going to have an endothelial layer. Okay. Then we're going to have other components that are a bit more variable. Okay. So we're going to have muscle layers. And when we're thinking about the vasculature, so all of these blood vessels, we're thinking about a type of muscle that we didn't talk all that much about in A&P 1. So in A&P 1, we talked more about skeletal muscle, like extensively. We talked about cardiac muscle as we talked about the heart. And we did briefly look at smooth muscle, but smooth muscle is going to be really important here in A&P 2. So smooth muscle is the type of muscle that we're going to find in the walls of our blood vessels. And we can see muscle layers of varying thickness in this image. Okay. We're also going to have connective tissue. So connective tissue is going to be made up of a couple different components. The major ones that we're going to be thinking about, or at least that we want to know exist, are collagen and an elastic connective tissue called elastin. So our fibrous connective tissue, the collagen, is giving like more kind of physical support. It's kind of stiffer. The elastic connective tissue is going to be part of what holds pressure. It's going to stretch, it's elastic, and then bounce back. So we can see that we have all of these layers in our arteries. We have them in our veins. When we get to capillaries in the future, we're going to see that those ones are really pared down. Right? So our capillaries are going to be the site of exchange in part because they only really have like one layer potentially there. Okay, so we're starting from the top with our arteries going away from the heart. Okay. So our arteries, their main role is to rapidly get blood out to the body, right? You want to rapidly get blood out to your brain, to your heart, to your lungs, your liver, to your GI, everywhere, okay? So because we want to get this blood rapidly to the different organ systems, we're going to have these big old arteries, big radius, big diameter, which means that they have low resistance, right? Blood flows through them like a fire hose, right? This is why you don't want to nick an artery if you're doing surgery or if you're in an accident, right? We've got this blood rushing through. Okay? So the arteries, because they're coming directly out of the heart, right? The arteries are under pretty high pressure, right? As far as blood vessels go, right? We've squeezed the heart during systole. That blood is now all in the arteries. Okay? So the walls have components to deal with that. So this is where we have both elastic and fibrous connective tissue there. So the elastin for the elastic part, the collagen for that fibrous kind of structural part. Now, not all arteries are super muscular, but some of them are. We're going to see more influence of smooth muscle, especially as we get smaller, as we get down towards the arterioles. But I'm just going to note here that we do have some muscular arteries. They tend to be the small ones. They tend to have less elastin, and they're starting to pick up that smooth muscle layer that's going to be particularly important when we move to arterioles. But let's stick on arteries for a second before we do that. Okay. So I think we've seen this picture before. We talked a little bit about the aorta coming out of the heart at the end of A&P1, but we're going to pay a little attention to it again right now. Okay. So our arteries, and our aorta especially, are a storage site for pressure. And we now know why that's important, right? So you need pressure in order to have blood flow, right? So you need a pressure difference. And to have a pressure difference, we need an area where there's high pressure. Right? Coming back to our flow equation. Okay. So our arteries at the top of our circuit are that storage site. Now, the way they store their pressure has to do with those walls, right? Those thick arterial walls that you've like touched in lab, right? So if you squeeze the arteries, that's one of the ways that we identify them, right? We can feel that they're a little stiffer than veins. Our veins are floppy, they're thin, right? The arteries that we've seen in the donor body lab tend to be white in color, so you can see that the walls have more to them. You can't see the blood through them like you can in some of the veins, right? So we've got these thick walls. They're elastic. So when we think about elastic, rather than thinking about the stretching, I think it's more important to focus on the bouncing back, right? When you touch them, they bounce back with this elastic property, okay? And this is a trade-off with another property called compliance, right? So our arteries are elastic, so they bounce back, put pressure back, act as a pressure reservoir. And this means that they have low compliance, because compliance is kind of a trade-off between pressure and volume. So we're thinking a trade-off between the size and how we respond to changes in blood flow. And we'll touch back on that again in a second. Okay. But when we're thinking about the behavior of the artery, right? So we're focusing here in this image on the aorta, because why not? And because that's where we're thinking about our mean arterial pressure. Okay. So your heart first fills, right? So you're starting in diastole when you're starting the first phase of the cardiac cycle. We're filling with blood, right? So we have the atria filling with blood. They're rising in pressure. We start to have blood fill into the ventricles. They're rising in pressure, right? Once the pressure is enough that blood from the ventricles starts feeling like maybe it should go kind of backwards, we have our valves close because we don't want to have backflow of blood. Our ventricles start to squeeze down, right? In our second phase of the cardiac cycle, that isovolumetric contraction, right? And once we hit high enough pressure from the squeezing, we shoot blood into the arteries, right? So that's our ventricular ejection phase, and that's systole, right? So systole is as soon as we start to squeeze. Okay. So picking up from the perspective of an artery, right? That's really important, that ventricular ejection. That's when we have blood coming into the vasculature, coming into the aorta. And so that's when we're going to see the blood vessel walls expand, right? So that's what we see in these arrows, right? So we see blood coming from the left ventricle into the aorta. And as we have that big lump of blood coming through, we're pushing open the walls, expanding the aorta. Okay. So long as we have lots and lots of blood flowing through, we're going to kind of be maintaining that pressure state, pushing out those walls. But as soon as this valve closes down, right, and we stop shooting blood into the aorta, we're moving blood forward into the systemic circuit. So we're losing the volume of blood here in the aorta, and the pressure is starting to drop. Okay. So during diastole, the relaxation part of the heart cycle, we have this drop in pressure. And as we have this drop in pressure, we want to keep the pressure up so that we keep a pressure difference across our systemic circuit. So we're going to have this elastic recoil of the aorta, so this bouncing back part of the aorta, continuing to force blood through our systemic circuit. Okay. So when we think about compliance, this is kind of our definition of compliance. So compliance is a relationship between pressure and volume. Wrote a reminder for myself. I think you can just memorize that arteries have low compliance, veins have high compliance. That's really the key fact that you're going to need to know for this class. But in order to remember that, it can be kind of helpful to look at a graph of pressure and volume to understand what's going on here. So I'm going to draw one just on the bottom here. Okay. So we're thinking about a relationship between pressure and volume when we're thinking about compliance. And when we say arteries have low compliance, we're going to draw like a low line here on our graph. When we think about high compliance, we're going to draw like a high line here for our veins. Okay, so that's the vein. All right. Low compliance artery. Okay. So when we say that arteries have low compliance and small increases in blood volume cause large increases in pressure. Did I draw this backwards? No, I didn't. Okay. So what we would do on here is read, here we have some arbitrary amount of volume, right? So we're imagining some blood, that's what we're thinking when we're thinking about volume, going into this blood vessel. So if we read over how much pressure that causes the blood vessel to have, our artery here is going to have some amount of pressure. But if we look at that line and where it crosses our vein line, we can see we've caused a much lower pressure here. So artery, pressure with that amount of volume, vein amount of pressure with that amount of volume. Okay, so we're causing these high increases in pressure with small increases in blood volume. And this is good from an artery perspective to have this low compliance because the heart is going to squeeze whatever amount of blood it's going to squeeze into the aorta. And we want that to create a high pressure. We want to create a high pressure because we want that aorta to keep pressure to go all the way through our systemic circuit, regardless of whether we're in systole or diastole. We're not going to want all that much pressure in our veins as we're returning. They're largely going to act as a volume reservoir. We also want them to be under low pressure because that's the opposite side of our equation, right? So when we're thinking about flow, right, in order to have a difference in pressure, we need to have an area of high pressure, our artery. We need to have an area of low pressure, our veins. Now, you can kind of relate these to like balloons if you want like an idea of something in real life that would have low compliance versus high compliance. You want to think about an artery like a water balloon, right? Imagine trying to blow up a water balloon with your mouth, right? You're going to have to, in order to get even just like a small amount of volume into that water balloon, you have to put in a lot of pressure, right? If you try to fill up like a big birthday balloon, those like foil ones, the Mylar ones, right? You don't have to put in hardly any pressure and you can get a lot more volume there. So in that case, the water balloon would be the low compliance balloon and our big foil birthday balloon would be the high compliance one. Questions about this relationship, this compliance stuff? It's worth some time letting it settle in your what, did I see a hand? Did I imagine a hand? Okay, I imagined a hand. All right. It's worth letting this settle in your mind for a little bit of time. At least for me, it took a while to kind of internalize this. Okay. But big picture, arteries, low compliance, veins, high compliance. All right. So the pressure in the aorta is going to vary a little bit with the cardiac cycle because sometimes we're squeezing blood into the aorta and sometimes we're not, right? During systole, during ventricular injection, we have blood coming into the aorta. During diastole, while the heart is relaxing, we're going to have a drop in pressure in the aorta, but we're trying to keep enough that we can keep blood going out to our organs. Okay. So when we measure blood pressures, like if you get your blood pressure measured at the doctor's office, right, we are going to be trying to measure both of those pressures, right? When we think about mean arterial pressure, mean, right, is an average, right? So we're averaging our systolic blood pressure, so our maximum pressure during systole, during ventricular ejection, while we have lots of blood coming into the aorta. And we're measuring a lower pressure, our minimum pressure, happening during that diastole phase, during that relaxation of the heart. It's not going to be zero because we don't have blood coming in, but we have those walls of the aorta recoiling, keeping that pressure up a little bit, but it's going to be lower than it is during systole. Okay. So if we're measuring blood pressure, the traditional way to do this is with a blood pressure cuff and a sphygmomanometer. Okay. So what we are trying to do here is basically as we inflate the blood pressure cuff, we're cutting off blood flow in an artery. As we release pressure in that blood pressure cuff, we're going to measure at what point blood flow returns, which means that we have enough blood pressure in that artery that it's measurably more than the air pressure in the cuff. And we're going to keep going. And then we're going to measure the point at which there's absolutely no impact on the flow through that artery, right? Because you can imagine in the middle there, right, you might have that high pressure pushing through the blood pressure cuff, but when our heart is relaxing, we're not forcing blood through, maybe it's closing back down again with those low pressures. And we'll look at what that looks like in a cartoon form, and then we'll take a listen to some sounds to try and relate this to real things you'll see in clinic. Okay, so what we're doing, as the slides say, we're compressing the artery, right? When we hear sounds, what we're hearing is turbulence, right? So remember when we were listening to heart sounds in December, right? We were listening to basically the waves of blood having that turbulent flow against the valves as they're moving, right? The same thing is happening when we're listening to blood pressure in your arm, right? We're listening for that turbulent flow, showing something is changing, something is going on. There's something impeding our blood vessel, right? So we're going to hear our Korotkov sounds as we listen to blood pressures, right? And the first time we start to hear that, right, if we've cut off a blood vessel, right, we're going to have silence, 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 so long as it's cut off. the first sound you hear as you're releasing, right, means that now that high pressure during systole is enough that some blood is making its way through. So the first time you start to hear the sounds of turbulent flow in the artery is that systolic blood pressure, is that high pressure. We keep going, we keep going, we keep going. If the sound is turbulence, we're going to hit another point where it goes silent again, right? At that point, we're just rushing along smoothly. Nothing's creating turbulence. So when we have this laminar flow is how we describe that. Our sound is going to disappear. So once we start to hear silence, that's our diastolic blood pressure. So in picture form, here's what's happening. I'll walk through step by step. Okay. So what you're doing as you inflate a blood pressure cuff is you're trying to get to a pressure that is so high that blood completely can't get through that artery while we have that pressure clamping down from the pressure in the cuff. That's why it can be a little uncomfortable, or it can feel like a nice tight hug, depending on your mood, potentially. Okay. So we're starting with a high blood pressure, a high pressure in the cuff, higher than any of our blood pressures, whether systolic or diastolic. So our peaks here on this image, we can see already are systole and diastole, but we're not going to measure anything or hear anything at this point if we have a blood pressure cuff with a sphygmomanometer and a stethoscope here, listening for those sounds, right? Because at no point are we forcing blood through. So keep going. So our next bit is we start to hear sounds, right? So the reason we hear sounds is when we have turbulent flow. So we can see that that turbulence happens when that systolic pressure is the same as the pressure in the cuff. And then later on, it continues because we are higher than the pressure in the cuff, right? So when we start to hear those sounds, we're hearing that turbulent flow. We're thinking like waves, right? As we start to have blood coming through. Then we keep going. Okay. So we keep going until we have a completely uncompressed artery, right? When we have no turbulence, no waves, nothing impeding our flow, we have this laminar flow. We're not going to have any sound. So that's diastole. Questions about this before we take a listen? All right, let's hope the sound projects the way I think about. Oh, sorry, I have one more equation for you before we take a listen. Okay, so that's how we're going to be thinking about our blood pressures, right? So that's how you would measure a blood pressure, like 110/70, right? It's important to tell you how we express these before I tell you. So measured blood pressure is systolic pressure, so the high pressure, over diastolic pressure, the low pressure. So the typical, I think, standard that you're comparing to is usually 120/80. Okay. So that's our blood pressure. Our pulse pressure, something slightly different. So our pulse pressure, right? Think about as you take a pulse, right? We're thinking about what is that pressure change that you feel, right? So your zero then is essentially the low pressure, the diastolic pressure, and the little bump that you feel. The pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. Okay. And important for us, because we're going to be talking about mean arterial pressure a lot, we already know that we're going to be using this number to estimate our delta P when we're thinking about blood flow. So our mean arterial pressure, our MAP, kind of a weighted average, right? So diastole is twice as long as systole. So we're going to add together systolic pressure plus our diastolic pressure times 2, because it's twice as long. Then we're going to take that whole quantity and divide it by 3. So that's our weighted average here that is giving us our mean arterial pressure. So over the course of a minute, that's essentially the average amount of blood pressure you'd have in the aorta. So this is what you would measure if you're at the doctor's office. this is the kind of number we're thinking about as we're thinking about our flow equation. Okay. So they're related to each other. You could figure one out from the other. A reminder, I put more things in here than I thought. Okay, so when we're thinking about that mean arterial pressure, right? So we're imagining a mean arterial pressure that's high, right? Should be relatively high. Central venous pressure, told you we're going to be kind of hand wavy with that. It's low. It's about 2 to 8 millimeters of mercury. All right. So we know that those arteries are dealing with high pressure. So go ahead and remind me. All of these, except for one, are ways that we are dealing with this high pressure, things that are related to that high pressure in the arteries. One of these things we have not mentioned as relates to arteries because it's not in arteries. One of these is a feature actually of veins. All right, let's take a look. Okay. All right. So let's think about that. So this has to do with those layers. So walking through these layers, right? We're thinking high pressure in arteries, which means we're thinking about walls that have to resist that pressure. And we want that pressure to bounce back when we're in diastole. Okay. So when we're thinking about connective tissue, right, that includes both the fibrous tissue and that elastin giving the elasticity, right? So the fibrous part is more for like physical structure, right? So that collagen is giving kind of structural support. So that is true of arteries as well as that elastic fibrous tissue, or sorry, that elastic connective tissue that gives us the low compliance. So those two things are in our thick artery walls. We do have more muscle in an artery than we would in a vein, although we're going to focus most on our muscle when we get to arterioles, largely because that's how we're going to regulate resistance. And it's our valves that we don't have in our arteries. So valves, when we see them, we're going to see them in veins, particularly in peripheral veins. They're going to be for resisting the gravity pulling blood kind of back to your feet. Maybe the reason people didn't pick that is we do know that we have one place we have a valve is basically the wall between the aorta and the heart. So right there at that connection, right? But we're not going to see valves anywhere else in our arterial system. So we really kind of lump that in with our understanding of the heart itself. Okay. Now let's listen to a blood pressure. Hope. We're going to start by blowing up our blood pressure cuff. See the pressure going up. We're going up high enough that we're above all pressures in our arteries. Now we're easing off the pressure. You know what it sounds like? Let's listen to that one more time, right? For the reason of, right? You will hear some other sounds. So you'll hear like any slight movement of someone's arm. You'll maybe hear some like crinkling of the cuff. What you're listening for when you're listening for the blood pressure itself is that thump, thump, thump that's consistent. And you can also kind of see the ticking of that sphygmomanometer, right? So the sphygmomanometer is that part with the numbers, right? So let's look at that once more now that we know what to expect. Oh, previous one. Da-da-da. Oh, oh, did it just do number 3? Okay. Well, there are lots of these on YouTube, so I'll let you listen once more, and then I'm going to ask you what you think you see for this. And out with the high systolic pressure and the low laminar flow of the diastolic pressure. Okay. Let's take a look at what we think we heard here. Okay. So let's look at it one more time, right? So remember, we're thinking about slight tick, right? We want to see the tick. We want to hear the tick for our high pressure, our systolic pressure, right? And then we're thinking about when we're losing that ticking sound for our diastolic pressure. Let's go right back. Hear how the loud ticking kind of started right before you hit that 90 mark, right? So that's why the 92 fit the best. And then it's right as we get to this 60 or 62 mark that we have that sound disappearing. I'm not going to be making you take blood pressures in this class, but it's pretty fun. So if you have a blood pressure cuff, you've probably tried already, but go ahead and try. If not, there are lots of these examples that you can quiz yourself on YouTube if you're curious. Okay. So what we're trying to do when we measure the blood pressure, right, we are getting information about the heart and the arteries, right? We're getting information about how much pressure are we putting into the arteries during systole, how far down are we dropping during diastole as the heart relaxes. And that also gives us information about the mean arterial pressure, which is important for the amount of blood flow that we get to our organs. Okay. So that's about our arteries. Now we're going to move briefly and intro our arterioles, right? So thinking about the order of blood vessels as we have branching coming out of the heart, right? We go arteries going away, right? As we start to have branching and getting smaller, get into the microcirculation, we're going to have our arterioles. And then we'll go to our capillaries. Totally out, right? Coming out of those capillaries, we're going to have venules. Coming back to the heart, we got our big visible veins culminating in our big superior and inferior vena cava, our largest veins. Okay. So the role of our arteries just now was to maintain pressure throughout the system and to receive that pressure coming out of the heart, right? So they're creating that delta P when we compare the arteries to the veins, right? Creating that pressure gradient across the system, right? So that's their main role. We're associating them with pressure, that low compliance. Our arterioles are going to be important for our resistance, right? So we're perfecting flow, equivalent to our difference in pressure divided by our resistance. That top piece, that delta P, that pressure difference, really reliant on the arteries and on the veins. Our arterioles are mainly going to be responsible for this resistance here on the bottom of our equation. Okay. So they are part of our microcirculation. So you're not going to find and name an arteriole in lab, but they are really important. They're connecting our arteries to our capillaries. We'll also see that we do have some meta-arterioles. We're going to lump those in a little bit with our arterioles. We'll take a look at one in a little bit. But that's our connection point here. We're getting to this point where we're eventually going to see exchange of several things, but really we're going to be thinking about fluid exchange for the most part. Okay. And so a thing about our arterioles that's going to be really important, that because we're changing resistance, right? This means that it's going to be really important that arterioles are able to regulate their radii. So we're going to regulate the radius. We're going to regulate how wide the arterioles are, because that's going to be able to make our resistance higher as our arterioles get smaller. It's going to be able to lower our resistance as arterioles get wider, right, as they dilate, right? So we talked about vasoconstriction and vasodilation last time. So vasoconstriction, constricting down the arterioles, raising resistance, vasodilation, dilating, widening the arterioles, lowering resistance. We saw something like this picture last time, right? So we see that across the arterioles, we have a big pressure drop. And you can see here on this image that in our arteries, we started out with high pressure. Our weighted average for this, our mean arterial pressure is pretty high, although we have variation depending on whether the heart is in systole and contracting or diastole and busy filling with blood. Okay. Those arterioles, as we start to have that pressure drop, are going to be responsible for the majority of the resistance in your systemic circuit. So they're about 60% of TPR. A reminder, TPR was our total peripheral resistance. So total, all of it, peripheral, out at the edges, resistance, resistance. So this pressure drop is about 50 millimeters of mercury. We're going to have a resistance that is regulated. So we're going to be thinking about both intrinsic and extrinsic regulation of the radius of the arterioles and therefore the total resistance of our system. So here's what we see if we look at an arteriole. We've got layers. We know we have an endothelial layer inside, endo for inside, endothelial. So think about it as like your inside skin almost. Okay. We have a layer of smooth muscle, and this is going to be really important for that function of being able to change the radius. And we have an outer layer kind of connecting everything together. We've got some connective tissue here. Okay. Now, the radius of an arteriole depends on how contracted the smooth muscle is. So we're thinking about the smooth muscle as like a ring, okay, around. So think like a kind of sphincter situation that we can contract. And when we contract it, the ring gets smaller. When we relax it, when we dilate it, the ring gets bigger. Okay? Now, unlike a lot of the things we thought about with skeletal muscle, smooth muscle has a kind of medium state at baseline. So we have tone is the word we use to refer to it in our arterioles. So our arterioles are toned. They're in this sort of slight middle amount of tension at their kind of baseline. Okay. Now the level of contraction is going to create different radii. And some of this is going to be under intrinsic regulation. Some of it's going to be under extrinsic regulation, that tone, kind of the baseline state. So you don't need any communication from outside to be at that arterial or tone state. Okay. But when we get signals, we can constrict. So we can contract that muscle, vasoconstriction, decreasing radius, raising resistance, and therefore lowering our blood flow. We can do vasodilation. So we're relaxing our smooth muscle. When we relax it, our radius gets bigger, which means our resistance gets lower, which means the amount of blood flow goes up. Now, the reasons we're going to want to do this, they have to do with directing blood flow to specific places. So we can use the resistance and the total peripheral resistance to maintain your blood pressure overall, and we'll talk about how that works. We can also use it locally within an organ to say, hey, we're going to constrict down blood flow over here. Don't come this way. Go over that way where we have larger, more relaxed arterioles. Okay. So we're going to be controlling how much blood flow goes to individual capillary beds and individual organs, as well as regulating our mean arterial pressure overall. And the reason we can do that, this is a preview, right? So the reason we'll be able to do that, and we'll talk about this in detail later on, right? We know that our mean arterial pressure is what we're using as a stand-in for our delta P. Our total peripheral resistance is what we're using as our resistance on the bottom of this equation. And we briefly mentioned that when we think about flow through the vasculature, that flow is really set by the heart, right? So the blood coming out of your heart, that has to be your flow for the system, right? So that is measured by your cardiac output. So we have this relationship between these three factors, right? So what is most able to change, right, is not so much going to be your cardiac output. We know some things that can change it, right? So we know that we can have changes to heart rate and stroke volume. But as we shift this TPR, this resistance, we're going to see changes to the mean arterial pressure if we're keeping that cardiac output consistent. Okay, so we'll leave that for later on. We'll stop here for today. The reminder, we don't have class on Monday. It's MLK Day. Go celebrate. Which means that your quiz for this week is due on Wednesday, so right before I see you.